to do this program today in any other venue other than the Saguaro Theater just wouldn't do it justice. It just seems right to have this here. And I want to publicly thank the owner of the Saguaro Theater for allowing us to have this here. This is a great community venue. A round of applause for the owner. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Eduardo Pagán. Dr. Pagán is a professor of history at Arizona State University, a nationally known and recognized historian of renown. His perhaps biggest claim to fame is, anybody here remember a PBS television show called History Detectives that was on 10 years ago, I think, about 10 years ago? Well, Dr. Pagán was one of the hosts of that show. He would go all around the country and examine various history mysteries and solve them, hopefully, in the context of a 15 or 20 minute vignette on History Detectives. But Dr. Pagán is our adjunct curator of history at the museum. He works still full-time at ASU, but we get him one day a week. And he's been a wonderful addition to the staff and able to do these kinds of programs for us. I imagine lots of you have heard Dr. Pagán before. So without further ado, Eduardo Pagán.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope this will be an entertaining and informative event that we have put together. I just want to say one thing about our Apache exhibition, and I think this is an important piece to understand about that. What we tried to do as a museum staff is we tried to listen very carefully to our Apache informants. As we had representatives from different Apache tribes working with us, advisors. And so our hope was really to give them the platform to talk about their own stories and their own experience as well. So it's not us as the museum staff telling their story. We provided the venue. And if we did our job right, then it is them telling their stories as well. So it's one of the things that I find very appealing about this exhibition that we have. So I encourage you to go see that. So let me start off by making introductions to my favorite Arizona historians. So we'll begin with Marshall Shore, who is otherwise known as the hip historian. I don't know why, but that is his name. And he also has the Arizona Happy Hour podcast. So I encourage you to log in and watch that. It's a lot of fun. Heidi Osselaer is another colleague of mine, published 2 books, Arizona's Deadliest Gunfight. This is the definitive work on the power shootout. And also Winning Her Place, or Winning Their Place. Is it their or her? Their place, all right, as well. And so this is a history of women in Arizona politics, right? So here's what we plan to do today. So I will start by giving you just a background of the event. The stage that ran from Wickenburg to Ehrenberg, right on the Colorado River, right? So I will set the setting for you. We'll talk a little bit about who was on the stagecoach, what happened, and then the question becomes, who were perpetrators, right? So we will present different theories. As it turns out, I will go first by presenting what was perhaps the dominant theory at the time, was that Indians did it. In fact, let me pause and say this as well, as I'm using the term Indians. In one of my previous jobs, I worked for a federal agency in Washington, D.C., and I worked among the tribal colleges. And so I got to travel, I got to travel to many of the reservations. All right, we'll try that. So, yeah, thank you. So I got to travel to many reservations in the United States, and it's the one term that I heard. I never heard First Nations, and I've heard Native American, I never heard, I don't know, the other terms that we have. I always heard Indian from the Native people themselves. And so that's the term that I tend to use when I refer to American Indians. I just tend to use the term Indian. So, all right, with that, let's go ahead. Hit the first slide. The lovely Natalie Olson in the back is our slide clicker. So here is the path of the stage line that ran from Wickenburg to Ehrenberg. Now, Up here, you see where Wickenburg is, and the road that runs to the west through Salome all the way through Quartzsite to Blythe that more or less parallels the stagecoach path. Now, Ehrenberg, the reason why they would go on out to Ehrenberg is the other side of Blythe, and the reason why they would do that, of course, is the Colorado River had boats running up and down, and this is where they would ship passengers and goods as well. So, next slide. All right, let's talk a little bit about the travelers who are on the stagecoach that day. Next slide, please. So we will begin with the driver. John, he was known as Dutch Lance, or Lentz, depending on what source you consult. He was recently come from California, and to his great misfortune, he had just been hired as the stagecoach driver for that particular line just a few days before. All right, so this was, as a matter of fact, on this particular trip 150 years ago, this was his first drive from Wickenburg out to Ehrenberg. So he was the driver. Okay, next slide. So Peter M. Hamill, as much as I can determine, he was born in Ireland, living in San Francisco for a while. He had registered for the draft during the Civil War. He was a member of the Wheeler Expedition. The Wheeler Expedition was a cartographic expedition sponsored by the U.S. military to basically chart out this land. And so Hamill was a part of that expedition. They had wrapped up when they came to Arizona. He was on his way back home. All right, next slide. William George Salmon or Solomon, again, depending on what source you look at. The most we can determine, that I can determine, is he was also a member of the Wheeler Expedition as well, and he was equally on his way back home. All right, next slide. Now, this is probably the best known individual on that stagecoach that day, was Frederick Wadsworth Loring. He was a native of Boston, graduate of Harvard University. He had just published a novel, Two College Friends, which had gotten some pretty good buzz, as well as a book of poetry, Boston Dip and Other Verses. He had just begun his career as a journalist, and so he was working for Appleton's Journal, and they sent him out in the spring to tag along with the Wheeler Expedition and to inform the readers back east about what was going on and what this mysterious land was like. So he was embedded, so to speak, with the Wheeler Expedition. And as I mentioned before, when the Wheeler Expedition came to Arizona, many of them disbanded from their assignment, and they were on their way back home. So Loring was on his way back home. This is probably the most popular photograph of Frederick Loring that was taken shortly before he was killed. And there he is with his mule. All right, next slide, please. Okay, now, Frederick Wilhelm Schoenholm, or Solomon, again, depending on what source you look at, he appears to have been born Friedrich Wilhelm Schoenholm and arrived in the port of Philadelphia from Sweden, if I remember correctly. I should have put that there. He was working with a firm in Prescott, L.B. Jewell and Company, and he was also on his return. He was returning on his way home to Philadelphia through the Colorado River and out to California as well. Then he was going to go around the Horn. So he had been away from home for many years. He was also on his way home, just passing through Arizona. All right, next slide. C.S. Adams. Again, what we know about him is he was married, had 3 small children in San Francisco. Next slide. All right, Wilhelm William Kruger. He was born in Prussia, which is modern-day Germany. In 1840, he served in the Civil War. He was serving for a time as a clerk in Prescott, also out in Ehrenberg, as I remember correctly. He was one of the survivors. Now the last slide. Mary Molly Shepherd. Again, as best we can tell, there's not a lot of information about many of them. She was also born in Ireland, 24 years of age. Reportedly, she was working as a prostitute in Prescott. And reportedly, she had saved her earnings and had them with her as she was making her way out again to Ehrenberg. Now, we're going to hear more about her a little bit later on. Kruger and Shepherd were the 2 survivors. All right, next slide, please. All right, just wrap it all together. Casualties, the ones on the left were the ones who were killed when the stagecoach was attacked. The ones on the right, William Kruger and Molly Shepherd, were the survivors. Now, there's a large question about Molly Shepherd. She was wounded in the event, Different sources say that it was a flesh wound on the arm. Other sources indicate that it might have been more grave. Because the name Molly Shepherd, as you can imagine, is such a common name, I've had great difficulty in finding out what happened to her. We just don't know. There is some speculation that she died. Some people speculate that Kruger killed her. I mean, the list goes on and on. Other speculation, I think Heidi might get into this as well, is that that William Kruger was actually Molly's pimp. But again, well, we don't know. That's just part of the speculation. All right, next slide, please. Now, the site of the attack, where this happened. Next slide. So again, here we are, Wickenburg. There is a rough approximation of where the massacre site occurred. Now, the reason why I say it's a rough approximation is there's also great controversy. You can go out and visit the site. There's a monument there. There's a lot of discussion whether that was the actual site where it happened. There are those who will argue that the site actually happened a little bit further out. For our purposes here, I simply want you to be familiar with the geography. Whether it happened here or perhaps 150 yards down, it doesn't matter so much for our purposes. I just want you to understand, and thank you. So here's what I want to point out. Notice, first of all, the topography, right? So you see all the hills, very, very difficult for a stagecoach to go over. So often what the stagecoaches did is that they followed the dry riverbeds or creek beds. That's often the flattest land, right? So that's why it takes this particular route here. And that's what I want you to see. All right, next slide, please. Now, this is a blow-up. I appreciate it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is a blow-up of what appears to be the actual massacre site. So these squares here indicate where the survivors were found and buried. Here's Scholholm here, C.S. Adams over here, Frederick Loring over here as well, Dutch Lance, the stagecoach driver, and you can see the tracks going right through there. And what is described is as they were moving through the wash, there were brushes, mesquite and other brushes that had been piled up to look like it was part of the desert growth, and behind them were the assailants, whoever they were. And so as they made their way through, the entire stagecoach was shot at perhaps a distance of 6 feet, okay? So almost in a moment, the majority of stagecoach personnel, the passengers and the driver, were killed instantly. All right, next slide. Now this is just another graph to give you a little clearer idea of what it looked like. Here's the wash going through, and then you see the burial sites. People were buried where they were found. You can imagine why, right? All right, next slide. All right, now, let's go on to the question about who did it. As I mentioned before, I have the opportunity of presenting the theory that the Indians did it. So I will present to you evidence why people believe the Indians did it, and then my colleagues will present evidence for other theories about who was responsible. So next slide. All right, let me set the background. What was happening in this area and northward, right? Northward all the way up to the Grand Canyon was an event known as the Yavapai War. You don't hear much about it, but there was a war underway from about 1865 all the way up until 1871. And basically what happened was that there was a Yavapai leader by the name of Anasa who was killed by settlers. And so the Yavapais then went to war to avenge his death, and they called upon their Yavapai allies, their Apache allies, and the Havasupai allies as well. So this entire area was aflame with native agitation, settlers being attacked, coaches being attacked as well. This had been going on before this particular stagecoach attack. Now, in 1867, Camp Date Creek was established to protect that very road from Indian raids. And then in December of 1868, this generally when the war conditions abated, and it's largely because diseases began to sweep through the native communities, and of course you're not in fighting shape at that point. But skirmishes continued with settlers all the way until 1871. In 1869, there was a reservation that was created at Date Creek Fort for the Yavapai. Next slide, and I'll show you exactly where that was now. Now this, just to give you some idea of the theater of operation for the Yavapai War that had occurred right before, for the years before this particular stagecoach was attacked. All right, next slide. Now, right there, see where it says Kirtland? That is Date Creek. And that's where the reservation was at one time. I understand you can go there now and you can see some adobe walls that are still standing from the fort itself. But to give an idea, all right, Wickenburg down here, you all know where Congress is, Yarnell as well. So the Date Creek Reservation was right there. And the reason why this is significant is because this was the nearest native population. Remember, they had been fighting a war with whites. They were forced onto reservations, right? And outskirts or skirmishes, outbreaks continued up until 1871. All right, next slide. All right, so that then leads us to the next theory, which my colleague Marshall is going to share with you about who else might have done this as well. So, Marshall.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all. I'm so happy to be inside this theater. I've looked at it outside for years. I'm so happy to be on this side of the door. So, okay, what big holiday just happened? Halloween. And so what do folks do at Halloween? They dress up. And so that's kind of how I want to launch into this, is because, you know, I could be wearing a whole different garb. I could actually be wearing things that match. But that wouldn't be me. I would be masquerading as someone else. So next slide, please. So how would you ever think that, okay, you know, all right, the Indians did it. Or did they? Not long after the event, there were newspaper articles where you could read about how they thought, oh my gosh, it was Mexicans dressed up as Indians. It was renegade white folks dressed up as Indians. Everybody was dressing up as an Indian, trying to figure out what was going on. All right, so next slide, because you could read about it all over the country. Because of Loring, it grew. The story just kept evolving, and everybody kept adding a little touch to make it their own story. Sometimes they might not be truthful, but then we have Molly, who may or may not have been a lady of the evening, may or may not have been a madam, may or may not have sold her business, may or may not have had anywhere between 50, or I guess it was like $5,000 to $40,000. And then there was all the jewelry that admirers had given her that has gone missing. Now, oops, don't turn that direction. So with Molly, when she had escaped, she was said, you know, it wasn't Indians, it was Mexicans dressed as Indians. Now you'll read other articles that say, you know, Herman Kruger said the exact same thing. Well, you know, not every article you read in the newspaper is true. Next slide, please. And then you have this man, Charles. Now he was friends with Wickenburg. May have actually been the first one to really call the city of Wickenburg, Wickenburg. He was also known for working with the local indigenous folks as laborers to help build things. So he was also a proponent of it wasn't the Indians that did it. It was anyone else. Because, as you can read, it's like it would have cost him a lot of money if he had become divisive between his chief workers and the other communities. So he was trying to make peace, but did he really believe that? Who knows? Next slide, please. And so then, when we start reading other newspaper articles, we can read about how one of the Mexicans that was implicated in the whole event may have been the last remaining person, wound up being arrested, then mysteriously hung that night in his jail cell. Conspiracy? Maybe. Maybe not. You can read other articles about how they would capture other Mexicans and had tied them into the whole event as well. So, maybe it was Mexicans dressed as Indians. Next slide, please. Now, one of the reasons why people say, it probably wasn't Indians is because in this skirmish, you had blankets that were just left on the ground after the murders. Those would have been very valuable, especially further north where it can get kind of cold. As well as there were guns and ammunition that were just laying there. It's like, if somebody was ammunition poor, they would have been happy to just bend over, pick up a weapon and some bullets, and scamper off. You also have the fact that mail had been tampered with. Letters had been opened and put back together. Why would they have done that? You also have the fact that some people said, there was money that was missing, and then some of the Indians were found with money in the exact same denominations that were missing. Then someone came forward and said, I paid them to do some work. And then you have the fact that you have people who actually followed the footsteps, those moccasins, up to Day Creek. But they didn't get all the way to Day Creek. They kind of went there and then took a turn. And so, whoever did it didn't go there. They went somewhere else. And so, then you start to wonder, maybe one of these alternate truths is the truth. Next slide. And then you start talking about how it could have also been another tribe that was masquerading as another tribe to throw shade on the tribe, if that makes any sense. But I mean, it's just, I think it's funny because it's like, you put on a mask and suddenly you can be whoever. And the fact there are people who said, it wasn't the Indians. You have Molly saying it was Mexicans dressed as Indians. You also have the fact, next slide, please. You also have the fact that we know here that they were recent, then they were shoved off into another reservation. So maybe it was someone trying to get that land that said, hey, if we cause a skirmish and it's blamed on these folks, they're gonna get in trouble. When you have kids, and they'll be like, oh, I didn't do it. He did it. And so you punish that kid. Then you find out it wasn't really that kid. So we really don't know exactly what happened. As time goes on, you can start to see the story evolving and theories that were talked about. As recently, the Arizona Republic did a big article in 2014 talking about all the possibilities and everything. And I think that's one of the fascinating things is the fact that we're still talking about this today. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about at the end of this. All right. Indeed, it is now your turn.
I'm going to sit down.
All right.
I'm going to sit here because I have to read my notes and I'm blind as a bat right now, so I apologize. Next slide. I have nothing but esteem for Eduardo and Marshall, but their theories are hogwash. You want to know why? Next slide, please. All right. I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to keep an open mind. As she spread her luxurious fur cape on the middle bench of the stagecoach, Molly Shepherd smiled warmly at her 4 male companions who were eager to join her in the popular poker game of Freeze Out. They, as well as the driver and 2 other passengers who rode up on top, had spent the last 24 hours traveling together in a very cramped stage that had left Prescott the day before and was bound for San Bernardino. 24 hours of jarring, no stops except to change horses. It was early on a Sunday morning, and she smiled and looked out at the gentleman inside the stage, and she had to be careful because one among them, William Kruger, was an old friend of hers from Montezuma Street in Prescott. Have you all been to Montezuma Street? Okay. Next slide. William had a brother, and his name was Frederick Kruger. They were both civilian clerks of the Army quartermaster, and they lodged together as well in a boarding house in Prescott that was owned by the military commander's wife. So they knew everything about the inner workings of the Army. And I don't know why any of these stories really never mention Frederick. But if anything was going on with his brother Bill, it was Wilhelm, they were Prussian immigrants, and Friedrich, but Fred, he went by, they were doing it together. So I have attached those two in this story because I think it's irrelevant. Both of them have been recently downgraded as clerks. They were leaving the nice environments of Prescott's Whiskey Row and trading them in for Ehrenberg. They were being sent there. Anyone been to Ehrenberg? It's about 120 all summer long, right? It's not exactly as nice. And I have a feeling they were not happy about the move. Frederick had already been sent there and had gone the week prior. And now William was traveling on the Arizona stage line. Could I have the next slide? And here they are together in the census of Prescott. You can see them. And I also have an article where they were both going to join him. And they was bringing over $40,000 in military funds that he knew he was transporting. And that the Kruger brothers and Miss Molly Shepard planned to steal. She was, like I said, had earned her way as a prostitute in mining camps throughout the West. She was an Irish immigrant, probably from County Tipperary. The pay was pretty good for prostitutes back in those days. But, you know, it was a tough job. And as you can see here, she was robbed of $3,000. Now, there aren't too many women carrying $3,000 in a mining camp. Treasure City was in the Nevada Comstock area. So she was robbed of that, and shortly thereafter, about 1868 or 69, she headed to Prescott. She was continuously involved in problems with the local tax collector in Prescott, lots of litigation, but she obviously, next slide, impressed. She was, the photo that Marshall had up was not probably, that wasn't Molly. These aren't Molly either, these were ladies of the night, and we don't know what she looked like. I do know she was quite tall, she was quite striking, and she impressed a lot of people, including one of our early state historians, Thomas Farish, who wrote in 1918, Miss Shepard was a member of the demi-monde, a beautiful woman who dressed in the height of fashion, extreme fashion, sort of like Marshall, who was adventurous. Obviously, you don't come to Arizona at that time, especially as a woman, unless you're adventurous, and said to be quite fascinating, whose charms found a ready market. Clearly impressed, maybe even smitten, the Kruger brothers invited Molly to join them to plot to rob the stage. Next question, next slide. We already know, as these gentlemen have ascertained, the stories were rampant in the newspaper about Indian outrages. It was on everyone's mind. And so it was easy to cast the Indians as a scapegoat. And that's exactly what they planned to do. Next slide. All three schemers began to divest themselves. This is on the same page of the Arizona Miner newspaper. You see Fred Kruger selling his mining claims, and Molly down there is selling all her belongings, all at the same time, right before the massacre. Does that sound suspicious? These people are getting rid of things. And Frederick's claim, he had just bought a few months before, and he's dumping it. And she's putting everything up for auction. And she's telling everyone she's going to go to Panama. And we know the Kruger brothers were going to Ehrenberg, but that's not that far. You could hold on to your claims, right? But they were selling. So the theory is, and this is my theory, but you can argue one way or the other, gentlemen. I don't care, but I think I've got the goods on you guys. Frederick was already in Ehrenberg, so he was going to go back surreptitiously to a remote area just west of Wickenburg and lead the attack on the stage from the outside. Molly and William, who I think were kind of an item, would be inside the stage. The gentleman would be armed with pistols and rifles, and Molly would be armed with her feminine wiles to distract the male passengers. Next slide. When they left Wickenburg early on the morning of November 5th, Molly insisted that the drapes be closed on the coach so nobody could see what was going outside. That was established in investigations. Before she started to deal cards for their poker game, she insisted all the gentlemen place their weapons in the bench underneath the seat cushions of the stagecoach. And then she spread her fur cape on the middle seat, allowing her lover, William, to hide his guns underneath. She then, on an early Sunday morning, passed the bottles around. There was lots of liquor, and the spirits flowed freely. And she probably flirted a little bit with the jeweler from Prescott, who had just sold his business and was traveling with a large sum of funds. And she probably also flirted with the flower company agent who had also sold out his business interests, and she knew was carrying lots of money because she knew everything that was going on in Prescott. So there was tons of cash, not just the military money, but personal cash.
Yeah, we don't know, and who doesn't love a good mystery? With that allure of the West attached to it.
I'm curious, since Molly was the only lady, are you sure she came all dressed in her garb? Why would she not maybe dress more like a man?
No. Women did not wear pants, if that's what you're suggesting back then. That would not.
She could have been masquerading.
Yeah, that would have been very strange for the period, for her to not be dressed in dresses, right? And a dress of some kind, perhaps petticoat as well. I mean, it just would have been very unusual for someone to be dressed that way.
So there were laws against women dressing as men in certain cities and things like that. Women were very restricted. She might have been wearing a travel garb, a travel outfit that's less of her working clothes, a darker, something that would stand up to the dust and dirt, but you would not go under any other way. She was a prostitute, and when you read accounts of prostitutes traveling in stages, people who are traveling always know that that woman is a prostitute because she's not dressing quite like the other women with children on the stage, and it's always very noticeable. They wear brighter colors, they're wearing all the fine silks and other things. So she was in restrictive garb, definitely. Otherwise, that would not have been a woman of her station. That was the required behavior.
You may have mentioned this, and I missed it, but who actually found the stagecoach, the murders? Who reported the actual incident?
It was Molly and William Kruger.
And they ran back where? I mean, who did they encounter?
They caught a stage that was going eastbound, a mail coach, and a few miles from the site, and they took it back to Wickenburg. But that was nightfall before anybody set out to go investigate this. Quite half a day had elapsed before that time.
Kruger and the woman could have left the scene before the eastbound stagecoach came and saw burnings. Is that possible? And so therefore they weren't even there. So the people that came upon it wouldn't have known that.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's entirely possible. Yeah. But again, because the eyewitness accounts are so few and fragmented and change over time, it's difficult to know exactly what happened at what point. We do know how many dead bodies were found. We do know that. The description of the stagecoach in terms of the bullet holes, where people were sitting, we know that as well. But beyond that, it's much more difficult. Again, as we've met before, Kruger's story changed over time. Why that's so, I don't know.
Do you guys know about the burial site having more bodies?
Okay, if I'm following.
So you want to say something about that? Yeah. Well, okay. So here's the other thing as well: is that if you go out to the burial site, there appears to be evidence that there are more bodies buried out there, and I don't know what that suggests. But one of the things that Heidi and I have been talking about is we would love to have some radar technology utilized to see if we can finally determine how many bodies are buried out in that site. So this is another question that's arisen about that particular site. There appears to be more burial sites than just those who were on the stagecoach. Who they could have been, we don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. If I'm following this correctly, the only witnesses that you have any statements from are the two questionable people here. Then you brought up the fact that you have somebody, stagecoach coming from the east. What did they see? Did they make any comment as to who was there and what they were wearing?
So the story, if you want to fill this in, the story is so that Molly and Kruger ran from the site and eventually intercepted a coach heading back to Wickenburg. So that coach was not on the road and did not, to our knowledge, witness anything. Yeah, yeah, did not know until they intercepted the man or the woman.
Yes, I had a couple questions. Like with the survivors, why would you sit in a coach knowing that it's going to be shot at eventually? They weren't that accurate with weapons in those days. I don't see that. Plus, you'd have, 4 other people in the coach to kill to get out of there. And I mean, even if you're a good shot, those pistols were pretty old. They malfunctioned. Doing that. Plus, like with the robbery, now they didn't have to kill everybody. If they were bandits, they could have just held them up, got their money and left. Would have took a lot of heat off of them. And then why would you let 2 survivors get away if you did kill them? It's 2 more people. All your witnesses are gone. The only way you get caught is if somebody saw you.
So it sounds like you're a believer in the Indian theory. Yes. Okay, all right.
Just out there this morning.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you said he was just out there this morning.
Just to quickly clear up a couple of things. The sequence of events seems to be that Molly and William fled the scene to the west, pursued by Indians on the bank above the wash where they were. Coming from the west was Wright Ball's wagon train. Unknown to Molly and William, they could not see them, but the Indians did. Immediately turned around and warned the ones that were ransacking the stage, and they all vamoosed, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you. And why didn't attack that wagon train, I don't know, but yes, thank you.
Just a quick question to clear up. Did the wagon or did the stage burn or did it not burn?
It was not burned. And in fact, it was in a barn or something here in Wickenburg for quite a few years until the teens or 20s. It was shot quite a few bullet holes, but it was intact. They think it eventually burned in a fire here, where it was being stored, but it was not set ablaze, not at all.
At that time, what did the Indians use for shooting? Were there rifles, or
Yes.
were it rifles?
Yes, whatever they could get, yeah. Yeah, rifles.
So
Yeah.
what were the bullet holes? Was it ammunition from a rifle?
You know, that's a great question. So what typically happened in the territorial period is that there was a coroner's jury that was convened on the site of whatever death that happened, whether it was the death of Henry Wickenburg or this particular massacre. And then the coroners, local individuals, using their best expertise, their knowledge of weapons as well, would then confirm what they could make out from the evidence. So to your question, the coroner's report that I've read doesn't go to that kind of detail. It confirms, in fact, these were rifle bullets as opposed to pistol or anything of that nature. They don't talk about the caliber at all. They just confirm the number of bullet holes that are found in the stagecoach.
They didn't have the technology that we have now to determine things like that. Those kinds of things were 20th century or later. I mean, you look at even things like fingerprints did not come into common usage till decades after this. So I think every report was just said bullet holes, and that was it. So
that stagecoach you're talking about, it burned up in Prescott. It was there at yeah, just the other side of Montezuma Street.
Wickenburg would have taken better care of it. Thank you.
So if there were bullet holes in the stage, how does that go along with the theory that William Kruger was shooting them from the inside?
As you can imagine, the stretch between Wickenburg all the way out to Ehrenberg, I mean, this is a lot of lonely country, and there were bandidos that were operating, right? Mexican bandits. There were white stagecoach robbers that were operating. It was an insecure road. So yes, there were other robberies that happened before this point.
If this were an isolated area, and there were no farms or ranches around, what would have been the reason for dressing up to look like someone else if you were going to kill all the people on the stagecoach anyway?
I'm not saying anyone dressed up. They left, my theory is, they left things for the investigators to believe that they were there. Because the three people that did the shooting were dressed, however. So I may be the wrong person now. But yeah, so this is really a thing of the Southwest in this era. Mexicans routinely would go and scalp people because there was, there were bounties on that kind of thing. There was, between the races, whites, Anglos, Hispanic, and Native American, there was this very confusing scenario of people pretending to be someone else to get away with, literally with murder. And that was routinely happening.
And I will say this is an interesting curiosity, is that there were reports of Native people dressing up as Mexicans, right, to get away with certain things. So yes, I mean, this kind of masquerading happened on a regular basis.
Some of the things you cite regarding things that the Indians wouldn't have done, like leave the horses, weapons and everything, are you aware of the role that Wright Ball had to play with the massacre?
Wright Ball, no.
Wright Ball was the leader of a wagon train of Teamsters.
Oh, yes, that's right, yeah.
Coming from Ehrenberg that actually interrupted the massacre, and they arrived on the scene while the stage was still burning and one of the victims was still alive, although he died without saying anything.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that was another report that came out, that one of the reasons why the valuables that natives would have taken, weapons, blankets, clothing, were left behind because they were interrupted because of another team of Americans that had come right upon the scene just, shortly after the massacre happened. And so then they took off. And this is why a lot of things were left behind that we're very curious to have been left behind. So thank you for that.
You mentioned that there was $100,000 possibly taken from this robbery. Did any of that money ever show up either by or remains of the chest or anything that was transported in, or anyone spending on unusual amounts of money?
You know, I think it's so funny when it's like, okay, you know, did they bury the money in the earth? Did they do things with it? It's like, you know, does anyone ever have a brand new Cadillac they just bought? Maybe they were out in the desert and found a little box with some money in it. I mean, I think that's an ongoing theme when you start looking at just Arizona lore. I mean, when you look at the Lost Dutchman, that there is this magic thing of money out there somewhere. And so, you know, I mean, maybe they made it all the way to maybe they made it to Panama. Who knows where they made it with that money, or if it's still buried out there.
So there was one account, I think you'd mentioned this, Marshall, there was one account that the Yavapai had paper money. So again, this is 1871. Apaches don't start moving on to reservations till 1872. So for the native communities, they generally don't use paper money, right? So then to be found in 1871 with paper money, the question then becomes, where did they get it? So there were some accounts of some Yavapai out in the Ehrenberg area that had paper money, and the suspicion was that they got it from this stagecoach robbery. Well, another explanation was they're actually paid for their labor to work on the roads over here. So to answer your question, we don't have a great answer. That's the best we can tell you. First of all, we don't know how much money was there. So there are different amounts that are reported. Could have been nothing, quite honestly. They could have made it to Panama. It could be buried out in the desert. We just don't know.
And just so you know, a lot of times the money is attached to the military more so because they're a federal entity. Most people in those days dealt with gold. And it was the fare to go from Prescott to San Bernardino was $50 in gold. They weren't accepting bills. Because bills had a sketchy reputation back then. They weren't always backed as well as they are today. They're the Bitcoin of the era, yes. So cryptocurrency. So I think there could have been gold on there too, that the gentlemen that were selling their businesses, that would have been gone. Somebody could have taken that and there wouldn't have been a paper trail for that. So we don't know if there was 5,000, there was money on board because people Molly had sold her business and her belongings, the other gentleman had, so there was cash on board. But whether it was in gold or, I suspect a lot of it was in gold, but the military money would have been in bills because they were buying and trading goods with at the quartermaster depot.
What record is there, if any, of the explanation given by the survivors of how it was they escaped or why they were spared?
They're a little hard to believe. Like I said, William Kruger did most of the interviewing, and he said that he carried Molly for miles because she was injured, which is unbelievable. And you know, they ran, and they were pursued by a dozen or more Indians. And she's wearing a long dress with multiple petticoats and a corset. How is she outrunning young men, whether Indian or Mexican or anything else, with guns? And the only one, and Kruger said he only had one small pistol, and Molly had a broken whiskey bottle, and that's how they were scaring off the Apache hordes.
So just to add a little bit more, so Kruger told his story numerous times, and you can find them published in various newspapers and sources. And it's kind of like the fish story, right? So the journey that they ran gets longer over time, right? And so we don't know really how far. And it's always been a question, how was it that these two survived? So think about it. You've got a warrior society that just now attacked the stagecoach, but somehow those two wounded individuals outran them. So that's been one of the questions about, I mean, one of the theories then about it must have been an inside job or something to that effect.
The military is usually pretty good about keeping track of its money. Is there any written record that there was actually money from the military on that stage?
I'm not familiar with military money on that particular stage. I don't know, have you come across anything?
I haven't had a chance. There are things like returns of posts and things like that for all the different depots and whatnot, but they mostly keep track of personnel. I'm not aware of any records that exist that show what kinds of money were being transported. Usually that they try to keep that secret to avoid being robbed. I'm kind of surprised if the military, as William Kruger said, was moving money to Ehrenberg, that they didn't have an armed guard on board. That was kind of the standard operating procedure.
Right, and some of you may be familiar with the WAM robbery that occurred out in Pima as well. And speaking of standard procedure, of course, this was an escorted wagon train of military payroll. So they did have an armed escort. And so that's missing here. The best that we can, that any historians can determine is if there was money, it was private money. There were people who had cashed out of their businesses of various reputations that were then moving elsewhere. So that's the best information we've got on that.
If the robbery was interrupted, why did Molly and William have to run away?
Great question. Yeah, it makes for a better story.
What, you're pointing out inconsistencies in the story? Really? Oh my gosh. So, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, in some ways, it was like the more and more I kept reading, researching, the less I knew about what actually happened. So, and then, yeah, I mean, so that was the fun of just kind of choose your own adventure.
And that's why this is still a relevant story 150 years later.
Exactly.
So, let's do this. This one now is we're going to take a vote. First of all, I want to give a hand to Natalie Olson for running the microphone. Thank you, Natalie. All right, so we're going to take a vote, and we will start off in the order that we're seated here. So we will start off. Who favors the inside job theory? Go ahead, raise your hand. Wow, look at that. Heidi, very well. Thank you so much. All right.
I vote for all of them.
That's right. All right. Who favors the theory that it was one party masquerading as another, whether they're Mexican bandits masquerading as Indians or something? Who favors that? That there was, okay, there were a few. All right, thank you. Now, who favors the theory that it was the Indians at the Date Creek Reservation? All right, so it looks like we should have a prize. I will buy you lunch, Heidi. That's what I will do. So it looks like most people believe that it was an inside job. All right, very interesting. Yes, here we go. All right. Oh, yeah, no, that's a very good question. So Marshall asked this question. Is that what you thought walking in today? No. So Heidi convinced you. Well done, Heidi. Excellent. All right. So, Dan, do everything to wrap it up? Okay. This will conclude our presentation. Thank you so much for coming out, and we look forward to doing more things of this nature. So have a good day. Thank you.